Hi, this is the video recording for our Grammar 1 class today, and we're going to talk some more about commas. So we've talked about commas in the past. We've talked about what I call structural commas. Structural commas are commas that are there because of sentence structure. So we've talked about these before. Remember that in, for example, a compound sentence, when we have a compound sentence, remember we have a main clause, two main clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction, and we have a comma when we have that structure. Or when we have a complex sentence, we've talked about if we have a subordinate clause that comes first, before a main clause, we have to put a comma there. If the main clause comes first, before the subordinate clause, there's no comma there. We've also talked about commas in parallel structure. So these are commas that are there because of the structure of the sentence. We've also had talked about commas, parallel structure, when I have three or more things in a list, in a sentence. So if I say I bought bread, comma, butter, comma, and milk. So we have to separate the things in the list, the bread, the butter, the milk, with commas, even the one before the and. We need a comma even before the and. So we have other lessons on that. Those commas are there because of a structure in the sentence. We also have, we've talked about appositives and relative clauses. Those are also structures that happen within clauses. And remember, we have separate lessons about those. So I call all those commas structural commas, all right? But then there's a whole mess of commas that have nothing to do with the structure of a sentence. And I just called these like little mechanical commas or other commas. So we're going to talk about those today. The other commas, other than structural commas. And these commas are fine. They're not too confusing. We just have to remember that we need them. So we're going to talk about, first of all, the commas that we use. I'm skipping around. If you're looking at today's worksheet, I'm starting with number 4, okay? So the first of these other commas we use to when we're writing down geographical places or dates. All right? So you know, or I hope you know, that if we're writing an address, if we're writing a city and a state, for example, if we say Glendale, CA, that we have to put a comma between that city and the state. So where are the commas that we need when we're writing an address? Now there isn't any rhyme or reason to this. It just is conventional. We put commas in certain places in the address. We don't. So imagine we're writing an address in a sentence. I lived at 1617 Donaldson Street, Los Angeles, California, 90026. All right, so if I were writing that in a sentence, where would I need to put commas in there? So we put a comma between, we don't put a comma between a street address and a street. So no comma there. We do put a comma between the street, the name of the street, and the city, and we do put a comma between the city and the state, but we do not put a comma between the state and the zip code. Okay? So think about it like this. If you were writing these on an envelope, we may or may not know, because we don't write letters anymore. But if we were writing this address on an envelope, it would be, person, whatever the person's name is, 1617 Donaldson Street, Los Angeles, California, 90026. All right, if we were writing it on an envelope like that, addressing an envelope, we don't put any commas in this line, right? But in this line, we put a comma between the city and the state, and we don't put a comma between the state and the zip code. The zip code and the state go together. They're a unit. This is an area of that state. Actually, it's an area of the United States. Okay? So, but the only difference would be if we were writing this in a sentence, then we would put a comma between the street and the city. Okay? All right. Now, so there's no logic to that. It's just that's the way it is. All right? So when we are talking about dates, we use commas in certain places when we're talking about dates. If I say July 4th, 1967, right? Where would I put a comma in there? I'd have to put a comma here between the day and the year. I don't put a comma between the month and the day, right? But I do put a comma between the day and the year. If I'm just putting the month and the year, so if I say July 1967, no comma. Only if I put the numeral for the day in there. All right? All right. So we also use commas when we have the titles of people's names. Titles or parts of their names that are sort of titles. So if I say Ralph Gomez Jr., I have to put a comma there before junior or senior or whatever it is. If I say Sandra Aslanian, MD, that means she's a doctor. Sorry. MD, that means she's a doctor. I have to put a comma between her name and the title. All right? All right. So let's stop the video there and come back and talk about some other commas. All right? And try some practice.